Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Tuesday, February 22nd, 2022. Happy Tuesday. Today we're going to be taking a look at the state of Arizona and 4 brand new polls from Data Orbital that shows that Kari Lake, of all of the potential GOP contenders for governor of the state of Arizona, defeats Katie Hobbs by a margin that is different than being in the negative. All of the other Republican potential nominees lose to Katie Hobbs in this potential one-on-one matchup between the current Secretary of State, besides Kari Lake. And I think that this goes to show an interesting point as to what name recognition can do and what the Republicans are doing in comparison to what a generic Republican can actually do. Taking a look at the coinciding approval ratings for President Biden on the nationwide level as the same polls that were taken today when it comes down to the state of Arizona, one will immediately conclude that Joe Biden is in the negative. And I don't think that's a shocker to any of you guys. From what you've gathered so far, Joe Biden has been in a pretty unfortunate position, and the Democrats have failed to recover from that point. I would say that right now, what we are going to assume and what we are likely going to face over the next couple of months is Joe Biden continuing to be in the negative. I don't see any type of significant improvement for Democrats in the immediate future, especially for Joe Biden. But with Joe Biden in the negative, what we are finding here is that Secretary of State Katie Hobbs is failing to capture more than 42% of the electorate against potential Republican contenders. And while that is a testament to the Democratic Party's inability to win over voters, it also is to the GOP as well, because the highest margin and the highest percentage point for any GOP candidate in this poll is 43%. Nothing super significant. So what I take away from the initial grasp here is that Kari Lake, of all of the GOP candidates, seems to be the most electable, but there is a lot more discussion that needs to follow, because it is a very interesting thing to see Kari Lake performing the best out of the rest of the GOP contenders. But again, a lot of it could very well come down to name recognition. So, taking a look at the state of Arizona, the last governor's race here was in 2018. Now, keep in mind, in 2018, the Democratic Party was able to win more seats from the Arizona House of Representatives than the GOP was, and that was the first time during the 2010s. In addition to that, the state of Arizona had flipped in the Senate election towards the Democratic Party. What we saw here was that Martha McSally lost the race to Kyrsten Sinema, a very well-known name now in electoral politics, who was able to rise in popularity across the state, previously serving as a House of Representatives member, as was Martha McSally. This race ended up going to the Democrats. But in the governor election, despite the Democratic Party performing significantly better in the state of Arizona than in any year prior over the past 10 to 20 years, Doug Ducey was still able to win the governorship by 14.2%. Just think about that for a moment. What you were finding in the state of Arizona was that the Democratic Party, while winning the Senate election, while winning the House elections, while winning any form of metric for a statewide vote, besides the governor election, this is something that goes to show that the GOP performs exceptionally well when it comes down to Arizona's governor elections. Or maybe it goes to show what the current governor, Doug Ducey, could have done back in 2018. Because Doug Ducey was a bit different. Doug Ducey was someone who was backed by a bunch of different unions across the state. He was backed by a bunch of different organizations. Many Democrats crossed over party lines to vote for Doug Ducey again. And he was popular. He was amongst the top 10 and 20 routinely. He never really found himself in a point where he was being disapproved of by the state. And that all changed during the 2020 presidential election. The 2020 presidential election was a year in which the state of Arizona flipped to the Democratic Party for the first time since 1996. I kid you not, 1996 was the last time that Arizona went blue. And when Arizona went blue, Donald Trump had asked Doug Ducey to find these fraudulent ballots, to not certify the election results, to send a different slate of electors to Washington, D.C., or to their state capitals to submit their, ballots when it comes down to the Electoral College. But Doug Ducey refused. He said that the election was fair. He said the election was free. He said that, Joe Biden fairly won the 2020 election in the state of Arizona, and that was enough for President Trump to push back on Doug Ducey. And in that pushback on Doug Ducey, he pushed back on this, what Donald Trump calls a rhino attitude, a Republican in name only. Essentially, Donald Trump uses that term to describe any Republican that isn't similar to him in terms of ideology. So, in the 2022 governor election, in which Doug Ducey cannot run for re-election, what you find here is that the current frontrunner of this race, Kari Lake, while being a former news anchor, actually replicates Donald Trump down to a T. I mean, she has taken some extreme stances. In fact, I would go so far as to say that she is more right-wing than President Trump on almost every level. Donald Trump has already endorsed her. He has already said that I want Kari Lake to become the next governor of the state of Arizona, and that's what propelled her in the state. I mean, when you look at who she's up against, you are talking about people who had ran statewide before. You are talking about people who had been in Congress before in 2 different districts, who ran statewide before. You are talking about people who should be defeatable, who should be winning in a Republican primary, who have the name recognition, who have the type of electoral experience to win across the state, and yet Kari Lake, being the Trump-endorsed candidate, has decided to run. And one person in particular who was expected to be potentially a major contender against her was Kimberly Yee, the Arizona state treasurer, who was at one point going to do well in this primary. But then Trump decided to endorse Kari Lake. Kimberly Yee would have been a much better pick. In terms of electability, absolutely a much better pick, but she definitely is a bit more reserved than Kari Lake. She definitely decides to take a pathway similar to Governor Doug Ducey, who likely would recognize a free and fair election like the 2020 election. So in that following months of after Donald Trump's endorsement, she has decided that she will no longer run for governor and instead will run for re-election across the state of Arizona. And it is, very, very a big deal that Kimberly Yee is now withdrawing from the race, because now what you're left with is just a singular Trump-endorsed candidate and no one else who has actually won statewide, no one who has actually won an election across the state, including Kari Lake, except for, get this, the Democratic frontrunner. Now, on the Democratic side, the reason why this poll is also very interesting is because the only Democrat who was polled was Katie Hobbs, and I think that makes a lot of sense. What you find here is that those who are deciding not to run or who have not announced their campaigns, you're talking about representatives, you're talking about mayors, you're talking about the minority leader of the Arizona House of Representatives. And what that means is that Katie Hobbs, being the only statewide elected official, is now running for governor in the state of Arizona, and she is going to do very well. She doesn't need any endorsements in this Democratic primary. She doesn't have any top names. She doesn't even have any of these representatives or state legislatures or really anyone trying to endorse her, because they know that she is more than likely going to win this primary. Taking a look at the polls, she has defeated all of her Democratic opponents by some pretty substantial margins. The only thing that actually defeats her when it comes down to percentage is the undecided column, which at some point is going to be enough to put her over 50%. The fact that she's at 46% right now with 39% undecided means all she needs is 4.1% of that undecided, and all of a sudden, there she is at 50%, across the Democratic primary. So it is going to be a very simple and easy pathway for Katie Hobbs through this nomination process, which means we pretty much know that she is 100% going to be that Democratic nominee for governor in the state of Arizona. But back to my point of the Republican side. Data Orbital released this poll that shows that only one Republican is actually able to defeat Katie Hobbs, but I don't necessarily buy that. I think that right now the Democratic Party is in a bad position, and I think it is fair to say that the Republican Party has some type of advantage over Democrats in many of these races. I don't know if it's enough to say that it is so lopsided in favor of the GOP in the Arizona gubernatorial election. On one hand, I do recognize that Arizona is a close race, but in my most recent projection, actually in the state of Arizona, I would argue against that. The state of Arizona, my most recent projection, goes to the Democratic Party by a lean margin. And I say that because the GOP has an extremely extreme GOP candidate. Kari Lake is not someone that I would say captures the essence of really any type of traditional Republican. She has taken some very extreme stances, and I'm not really that shocked. I think what she is doing is going to work in the primary, but I can't imagine it working in the general election. And I'll show you which data actually might suggest that to be true. Kari Lake defeats Katie Hobbs in this poll by 1.3%, but when you take a look at other polls that have been taken, she actually loses. In addition to that, one thing that I do want to point out is that there is polling of a generic Republican versus a generic Democrat. On one hand, I would say that no one is ever generic. No one is ever going to be fitting that stereotype that people think about when they vote for a generic Democrat or a generic Republican. Generic pretty much is just the baseline. But since we are working on a baseline here, in the most recent OH Predictive Insights poll, what we find here is that a generic Republican defeats a generic Democrat by 4 percentage points. Well, taking a look at all of the polls here, what do we find? Katie Hobbs defeats Karen Taylor Robson. Katie Hobbs defeats Matt Salmon. Katie Hobbs defeats Kari Lake in some polls and defeats Steve Gaynor in others. Katie Hobbs only loses to Kari Lake by a margin of 2 points according to Data Orbital, which is a Republican-leaning pollster. If the generic ballot here is showing us, if the generic Republican versus Democratic matchup is showing us with the Republican Party at a 4-point lead, and yet Kari Lake is only ahead by 2, it tells you that there are voters there that are fine backing a generic Republican, that are fine backing someone like Doug Ducey, but are not fine backing Kari Lake. And I think that's where the major worry comes for the GOP. Because while Kari Lake will more than likely win this Republican primary, she is such a polarizing candidate. She has taken stances that are just not right to take. She has called on the arresting of Katie Hobbs for the 2020 election. I mean, she literally has said that she wants her potential Democratic opponent to be arrested and thrown in jail for the 2020 election. That type of rhetoric I don't think will play well across the state of Arizona. I think from what we have seen so far, while Kari Lake does defeat Katie Hobbs, I think that is more of a testament to the Democratic Party being down nationwide rather than a testament to Katie Hobbs being down in the negative. Joe Biden is disapproved of by double digits in the state of Arizona, and there isn't much data to contest that. You know, looking at that disapproval rating for Biden, disapproval rating for the Democratic Party, yet somehow Katie Hobbs remains at a point where even a Republican pollster can barely put the GOP ahead by 2 points at most in an adjusted margin of 1. What we are finding is that the state of Arizona is more likely to elect Katie Hobbs. I think they are putting themselves in a position where, Katie Hobbs, the Democratic Party is putting themselves in a position where they have a sane statewide candidate against someone who is taking extremely partisan stances. Someone like Kari Lake, someone who is Kari Lake, who cannot appeal to independents the same way that Doug Ducey did. I mean, there is a reason why there was so much crossover vote. Democrats liked Doug Ducey. I can't imagine any Democrats liking Kari Lake. She has completely tried to invalidate our 2020 election. She has completely tried to invalidate any legitimacy of the electoral process entirely. And with what type of experience? With what type of, proof to her name over these claims? None. Literally nothing. And yet somehow, that's something that the Democrats think, the Republicans think, is going to help them in the general election. While this poll individually may show Kari Lake ahead, we can't ignore the fact that other ones show her behind. And we also cannot ignore the fact that she is underperforming a generic Republican. Also, this is a Republican pollster. All of the signs seem to indicate that so far, Katie Hobbs seems to be faring well. While Kari Lake may be ahead, that's not enough to say definitively that she loses. I think from what we have captured from the state of Arizona, when it comes down to these recent polls, that the Republican Party does not nearly have as much of a monumental lead as previously thought. This is not the impact of Joe Biden's disapproval rating to the fullest extent. If people were to take Biden's approval rating in Arizona to the fullest extent, you would see a safe margin of victory for the GOP across the state of Arizona. Taking a look at the 20 to 25 point shift nationwide from just a year ago today between now, you are looking at a state of Arizona which has only shifted by maybe just a couple of percentage points. That's why the Republicans are sort of lagging behind. That's why every other Republican nominee loses to Katie Hobbs despite Biden being down significantly in the state of Arizona. I think there is a lot to be unpacked here. I think there is a lot to discuss. Why isn't the GOP doing as well? Why is Kari Lake the only Republican nominee amongst a Republican poll that can defeat Katie Hobbs? Why is this happening? Why is the margin at most being 2 percentage points and an adjusted margin of just 1? What is going on in the state of Arizona? And these are the things that need to be taken into consideration by the GOP, because you should never have a front-running GOP nominee underperforming the generic Republican. An individualized, personalized candidate should be getting a lot more of the vote share than someone who is a generic Republican or a generic Democrat. Unless you're talking about extremely partisan states such as, West Virginia, where a generic Democrat obviously would lose, but Joe Manchin is not a generic Democrat. Arizona is probably one of the closest races when it comes down to this upcoming midterm year, and was one of the closest races in the 2020 presidential election. There is just so much going on across the state of Arizona that I'm not really comfortable taking this poll to full accuracy. I'm just not comfortable taking this enough to say that it is definitively going to go to Kari Lake or definitively going to go to Katie Hobbs. It is going to be an extremely close race, and I think a lot of us expect that. While the betting markets may show the GOP in a significant advantage, I would also say that, they need to be cautious about some of these decisions because some of these Republican nominees, like Kari Lake, truly could weigh down the GOP altogether. There is a reason why the polls aren't showing the GOP as up as much as they actually need to be. And compared to the most recent election in the state of Arizona, you're talking about a pretty dramatic fallout relative to the last election. And a pretty pretty drastic fallout relative to the 2014 election as well. I'm interested to see what happens in the state of Arizona this November. I think what we are going to find is that Katie Hobbs and Kari Lake are likely going to face off against each other. I want to see if Kari Lake decides to go down a more centrist, more moderate approach as she enters into the general election, as she panders to win independent voters, the same way all politicians do, but part of me thinks that she won't. Part of me thinks that she will stick with this type of rhetoric, this type of insightful type of discussion and attacking of her political opponents. And part of me also thinks that she could very well win this. While my most recent projection shows the Democratic Party ahead, I wouldn't exactly say that it's a done deal by any stretch of the imagination. Arizona could still very well go red, and it has gone red in numerous elections in the past. It's not out of the ordinary, especially given our upcoming national environment. So all eyes in Arizona. I think there's going to be a very interesting election here, and I want to actually see if Kari Lake, if she was to lose, if she would accept those election results. But again, that's discussion for another video. State of Arizona right now in the most recent poll from Data Orbital shows that the GOP is ahead by 1 point against Katie Hobbs, but loses to her against all of the other nominees. Very interesting comments, very interesting results, and I think it will truly be tested to theory this upcoming November election. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2022 election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.